I won't tell you the story how I got to know Jill for the first time, but I can tell you as an opening for presenting the next speaker how I got to know Sabine for the first time. I got an invitation from Sabine to come to a conference with the title that I never forgot. The title was Children and the Good Life. And then Sabine co-edited a book on the same title, on Children and the Good Life, and since then we found many projects that we are working together, including some big international research projects. And today Sabine is going to speak with us specifically about the research she was doing on sexual abuse in residential care in Germany. And if anybody here is following or followed what happened in Germany in the last 7 years or 8 years, there was a big scandal of sexual abuse in some of the elite residential schools in Germany with the involvement of some of the top figures in the field of residential care in Germany, and that spurred a big debate and a big interest in the issue, and I think we are going to hear at least some of the very thoughtful thoughts of Sabine based on her research there. So Sabine Andresen, who is a professor at the Goethe University in Frankfurt right now.
Thank you very much, Asha, for this nice introduction. And first of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation and especially for your great hospitality. I'd like to thank Asha and Nat and all the colleagues from Haruv and the School of Social Work. And let me say, especially in these days, this hospitality in a way warms my heart and inspired my intellectual thinking. And thank you for that, and thank you for bringing me to Jerusalem. I changed my presentation this night a little bit when I heard all the presentations, the great presentations yesterday. And I'd just like to refer to the title of the conference, Child Maltreatment in Context. And I asked myself, what is a context when we're talking about child maltreatment, and what kind of contextualization is meaningful in that way? Now I feel warm enough. So we can focus on the global level. We try to do it with our research project on child well-being, Children's Worlds, but we can also focus on the national level. We can focus on the welfare system and our school system and how it is related to each other, and what does this kind of context mean to child maltreatment. We can focus on regions and neighborhoods, on single schools or single child protection centers. We can focus on the level of the family as well as on the level of family networks or children's networks. So another question which seems to be important in my eyes is, how could we or how should we conceptualize the context? And I would argue for a, let me say, multi-dimensional concept of the context. And I think relevant dimensions of a context of child maltreatment are power hierarchies. What do we know about power hierarchies between children and adults, between girls and boys, between men and women? Another dimension is the dimension of capacities and capabilities of adults as parents, as mothers and fathers, or as professionals. It seems to be important what image of the child is relevant in a specific context. So then another dimension is the knowledge about vulnerability. We know we have some good empirical evidence that the knowledge is important, but it's very different what kind of knowledge professionals, for instance, have about the vulnerability of children. What we know from our studies on child well-being is the importance of, let me say, good enough balance between taking care for the children and giving them enough space, freedom, free time. Then another dimension, the awareness of dependency and a general attitude towards children's rights and the voices of victims. And another one is a general interest in children's perceptions of maltreatment. And that is one thing I'd like to talk about a little bit later on with respect to my research. So I think there is a responsibility of researchers, of professionals and policymakers to, let me say, develop a space which offers children and adolescents, as well as victims, pathways to talk about their experiences, knowledge and perceptions about abuse. And I think Jill Corbin talked about the culture and the issue of culture, and it could be interesting or necessary to figure out what is the culture of children themselves. What do they have a culture, and what does it mean when we do research on child maltreatment? So taking this into account, I'd like to focus on the national level as a context, the national level in Germany, and some of the political tasks to recognize victims. Asha already mentioned that we have an ongoing debate in Germany, and I hope it will be a little bit interesting for you to hear about it. And second, I'd like to focus on the institutional level of residential care and how we could find a way to research on children's perceptions. So coming to the national level in Germany and the political task to recognize victims. Since 2010, Germany has experienced a previously unseen increase in public awareness regarding the problem of sexual abuse in childhood and youth. And we had this discussion yesterday, and I just talked to Kamit about it. In Germany, we observed a very important role of the media, because the media often took care in that period of the interests of the victims. So that was really interesting. And now we have some interesting and, let me say, good publications from journalists, not from researchers, from journalists, about sexual abuse in boarding schools, for instance, or in the Catholic Church. So the role of the media here is very interesting. One, let me say, starting point in that time was that the head of a prestigious Catholic school in Berlin went to public and talked about sexual abuse in the 1990s at his school. And what happened then in that time in Germany? There came up some political strategies on a national level. They established a roundtable on child sexual abuse headed by the National Ministries of Justice, Education and the Family. Then they established a post of an independent trustee to deal with sexual abuse issues. It was established within the Family Ministry and provided with the service of a group of expert advisors. Now there are ongoing agreements with, for example, the German Sports Federation or the churches on how to develop protective concepts. This is also really interesting. And the Ministry of Research has allocated funds for research, initially in the health domain and then in education. And it is also funding junior professor posts at selected universities to meet the need for a greater degree of professionalization. Because what we observed in our national context, that there is a lack of knowledge within the universities, and so we thought this has a major impact. So another thing is that we see a lot of campaigns like this one, Breaking Silence Breaks the Power of the Offenders. And with this campaign, we got a lot of information from victims, letters, telephone conversation, and we have an evaluation on this, and it offers a first insight of knowledge about the perceptions and experiences of adults who were victimized in their childhood and youth. And we have an ongoing number of single reports on institutions, reports by the national or state governments, and reports commissioned by boarding schools and residential care. So there are two new political strategies, and I think this is could be an interesting experience now. In this year, in 2015, we in Germany established, we call it in German Betroffenenrat. I try to translate it into Commission of the Interests of Victims. And in this commission, we have 15 members who experienced sexual abuse in their childhood, who experienced that in different contexts, and we translated it as context in the family, in sports clubs, in schools, or residential care. And we will ask them, or the idea of this Commission of the Interests of Victims is that this group should give advice to researchers, to lawyers, to policymakers, institutions and professionals, what is important from the perspective of victims, what should we have in mind as researchers, how could we involve them when we develop a new research project, and it's in a way a more participatory thinking about this issue on maltreatment in general and especially on sexual abuse. And the second new thing is that we will have an independent commission to inquire sexual abuse. It will be established next year, and then it should work for 3 years with 7 members from different fields like law, history, education. And this independent commission is responsible for research, for public hearings with victims, for confidential hearings, and it has the duty to report to the public. It is not that kind of commission like the Royal Commission in Australia. We heard about it during a discussion yesterday afternoon. But I think with these two strategies, focusing on the voices of victims, this offers us a new insight and new opportunities to focus on experiences. So, having this in mind, I'd like to come to the institutional level of residential care and how we could find a way to research on children's perceptions. So on the national level, I tried to show the importance of talking seriously in several fields with victims and having their perceptions, their perspective in mind. And now I'd like to focus on children and adolescents and what does it mean for research. So I'm focusing on a research project within the context of residential care. And what I'd like to say at the beginning here is that we had in Germany also a roundtable on abuse and neglect in residential care in the 1950s and 1960s. And from that round table, we have also reports on violence against children and young people in that field. And we have a national fund of restitution for victims of residential care in the 1950s and 1960s. But there is a huge debate in Germany because the victims of child maltreatment in residential care complain a lack of recognition compared to victims of sexual abuse of prestigious boarding schools. So this is really interesting, and this is an issue of, Jill mentioned it at the beginning of her talk, of inequality. How do we recognize the differences within social groups? And this is a very sensitive topic. And another one, and this is a debate especially in the field of professionals, and some of them are arguing against this in their eyes, too intensive focus on sexual abuse, since we had the scandals, and not on other forms of abuse and neglect. And this waves of thinking and focusing on special types of abuse is a serious problem, and we as researchers has to find a way to deal with this public observation. Coming to the child sexual abuse within pedagogical institutions in Germany. First of all, we had really a lack of empirical data, a lack of knowledge. And in 2011, a study came out from the German Youth Institute in Munich, study sexual violence against girls and boys within institutions. And with this study, we started to examine the extent to which pedagogical institutions obtained knowledge of sexual victimization by personal peers or outside the institution, by questioning mainly the head of the institutions, the management of the institutions. And in this study, more than 1,100 heads of schools and 700 teachers in boarding schools, as well as professionals in residential care, were asked. And they were asked what kind of reports they experience in their institution, and from which context the offender came. And as you can see, the main impact here is that the offender came from outside the institution. Then they experienced sexual abuse or harassment within the group of peers, and then from the professionals within the institutions. And here, at this side, the right side, is the part of the residential care. So this study offers us an insight how important it is to focus on residential care institutions and how young people from what kind of field young people experience abuse. I'd like to come to our own study, the survey of the experiences with sexual violence of adolescents in residential care institutions and boarding schools. And this study is part of, I talked about it, of this funding line of the Ministry of Research and Education. And it is a cooperation together with the University of Ulm, and I will give you just an overview about the methods, the methodology. This study focuses on the perspective of young people living in boarding schools and residential care institutions in Germany today. The research design, the study used quantitative as well as qualitative methods, and a quantitative survey questions 322 young people living in 32 institutions, 20 in residential care institutions and 12 in boarding school. And in the qualitative survey, we used to have group discussions and individual biographical-oriented interviews. And I'd like to give you just an overview about the quantitative finding, and then I'd like to refer to some qualitative findings about perceptions of young adolescents in residential care. What we got, and we are just in the process of analyzing the data, what we got from the quantitative finding that 27.4% of the young people reported that they had been sexually harassed ever in their life. 50% reported that they had experienced sexual offenses without penetration, and 25% experienced sexual abuse including penetration. We ask focusing on their lifetime and not on their time in the institution. So in total, 57% of the respondents reported that they experienced one of these situations as a victim, and female respondents are significantly more often affected than male respondents. And what is important here was focusing on the context that adolescents living in residential care institutions experience significantly more often sexual abuse, including penetration, than young adolescents in boarding schools. So the context is different. We also ask in the quantitative questionnaire own sexual aggressive behavior, and we got here some maybe also interesting information. Close to 12% of the respondents quote that they had committed sexual harassment at least once in their life. 15% had committed sexual offenses without penetration, and 4.6 sexual offenses including penetration. So male respondents reported in totally significantly more often own sexual aggressive behavior, but we see no significant difference between residential care institutions and boarding schools in regard to own sexual aggressive behavior of the young people. So this is just an overview from this quantitative, some of the quantitative results. And I think with quantitative methods, we can get a sense of experiences of young people. We will not get a sense of their perceptions and their ideas they have in mind when we talk about sexual abuse or sexual violence. And therefore, I'd like to focus a little bit on our qualitative findings. And the aim and the research interest of the qualitative part of the study was the reconstruction of sexual violence from young people's point of view. And we mainly focus on the collective orientations and knowledge referring to sexual violence of young people living in residential care and boarding schools. And I would like to focus today only on the focus group discussions and not on the biographical-oriented qualitative interviews, because this is another method, another kind of material, qualitative material. And I will focus on the collective orientations and some interesting points for in this field. So one question I'd like to raise here is it within the culture of young adolescents, is sexual abuse still a taboo? And I raised a quote here, it's not such a big issue here. And what we saw in our material, in a first reaction, young people often feel that it is not a big issue, meaning that sexual violence does not take place in their institutions or in their life together, or they state that adults conceal the subjects from them. So I like to give you just only one. I know with qualitative material we can show you so many quotes. I would like to show you only one sequence from a focus group discussion. It's a discussion in a residential care with 4 young men. And the first one started, and this is focusing to how they react in the first time on this issue of sexual abuse. And he started because it doesn't affect you. You have no connection with it at all. And then he refers to a comparison with the war reports in the television. So you get some information, but it doesn't affect you. And then he's going on, and it is the same with sexual violence, because in my life, this is far away. Until now, I did not have any experience whatsoever with it. So I cannot say that I have intensively ever dealt with this topic. Then another boy came into the discussion. Can you remember the girl that has been harassed by that guy? Then the first one, well, yes, good, okay, yes, if you consider that way, this case we all know. Well, this case, the case of girl X and boy, then they mentioned some name, and then the first boy said, let's call her girl blonde. And I see, yes, all right, okay. Then I have to, well, revise in any case. So this is an interesting, I think, example how they react and how they try to find a way together to think about their perceptions as well as their knowledge and experiences. So we call this topic the hidden subject. So young people talk about sexual violence in terms of 2 directions: closeness and distance as narrative strategies to deal with the difficult topic. They struggle to find a useful definition of the term sexual violence, and they don't put sexual violence into concrete terms. So, first conclusion, it further shows that young people try to find a common ground to talk about sexual violence, even in the difficult situation of a group discussion with a difficult subject. So the challenge for research as well as for professional is how could we encourage young people to talk about this issue? Young people in institutions have diverse experiences with sexual violence in different contexts, even if they are not affected themselves. But only few experiences in talking about sexual violence, and I think this is an important point to we have to refer to. So still we can say this topic is omnipresent but silent. And what they often mention in the group discussions is the speechlessness of adults, especially professionals. And this is a challenge in general for prevention and intervention. How do adults who live together in a specific context with young people, how do they call sexual abuse, how they do talk about it, and do they offer a space? Let me just briefly come to what we call, with respect to the methodology of documentary methods, the collective orientation. Collective orientations, especially when we focus on the material of focus group discussions, is the implicit and explicit orientations and concepts according to sexual abuse, about the knowledge and structure and the way of talking about and dealing with sexual violence in everyday life. So we try to reconstruct behavior, attitudes, and beliefs of young people. And we see a collective orientation in our material that sexual abuse has to do, in the eyes of the young adolescents, especially when we talk to girls, with limits. And here we see two types of limits. They define limits as a capability, and the second type is respect the limits, your own limits, or the limits of others. And coming from that, then we reconstruct the kind of knowledge the adolescents have about sexual abuse, sexual violence. And I'd like to finish with giving you some brief information about the implicit knowledge they are negotiating within this focus group discussions, because that is the interesting issue when you work with this qualitative material, to get a sense what kind of implicit knowledge is important and how this affects the perceptions and may the interaction between young people in the peers or between adolescents and adults. So one aspect of implicit knowledge is being young, female and unknowing. These are mentioned as risk factors to experience sexual violence. Or another point, sexual violence has to do with differences in age and power imbalance. The female respondents focus on sexual violence, which is linked with the ability to decide self-determined in sexual relationships. This is an interesting point for our research project, Daphne. Young girls, that is an issue of knowledge in the female group discussions, are sexually immature and not able to decide self-determined in sexual relationships. Or another issue of knowledge here from the male respondents, physical force helps to protect yourself from sexual violence. So this is an important issue of knowledge within the context of residential care. So this gives you an insight what kind of knowledge adolescents have when they are in the context of residential care. And we have to have in mind how this kind of implicit knowledge has an importance for the perception young people have and for their interactions. So, and this is the, let me say, a potential of qualitative research. And so just the last one here on the slide, that always came up in the focus group discussion, the issue of protection. So they know sexual violence can potentially happen to anyone, and they always raise this 100% protection against sexual violence is not possible. So let me come to an end. What I'd like to show, or what I'd like to argue here in this discussion, was that when we focus on child maltreatment, not only on sexual abuse in context, we have to make sure that we hear the voices of children and adolescents. And what is the methodology for this, making sure to hear the voices of children and adolescents? And I'd like to argue that we should find pathways in the different contexts, the context of research, the context of policy, and the context of professions, how we could discuss with victims and how could they give advice to the several fields. And I think this is, in my eyes, challenging for researchers, but it's also an issue of responsibility. So thank you very much for your attention.